образовательных программ Ельцин-центра. Очень рад вас видеть, особенно тех, кто у нас впервые. Я не припомню такой большой аудитории в Ельцин-центре за 4 года в дневное время. В общем, мы с вами бьем рекорды сегодня. Спасибо, что вы с нами. Спасибо, что вы пришли. Образовательные программы Ельцин-центра разнообразны, они посвящены самым разным темам. Это и история России, это и развитие гражданского общества, это и информационные технологии, то, как они меняют разные сферы нашей жизни. Все это в наших программах существует в виде тематических циклов. У нас их около дюжины, каждый месяц программа состоит по одной лекции из каждого цикла. Таким образом, у нас набирается лекции 15 в месяц, на которые мы рады вас пригласить. Пожалуйста, приходите. Но кроме этого, мы проводим еще и вот такие мероприятия, я бы назвал их партнерские или специальные программы, которые мы анонсируем, может быть, не так заранее, но я смотрю, для нас это, вообще говоря, не проблема. Сегодняшнюю лекцию предложил мой друг, преподаватель многих из вас, директор Института государственного и международного права юридического университета Данил Сергеев. Давайте Данила поблагодарим за это. Потому что гость действительно уникальный. Но в чем его уникальность, расскажет нам Данил. Данил, я бы хотел, чтобы ты представил нашего гостя.
Главная уникальность в том, что у него двойное имя и двойная фамилия. The only man I know with double name and double surname. Kwan-Lamar, full name is Kwan-Lamar. Можно просто Kwan, если вы задаете вопрос. Kwan. About his name, you tell story about your name during the lecture.
Yeah,
sure. Он сейчас занимает должность ведущего научного сотрудника Офиса Мэра Нью-Йорка по уголовному правосудию, но это только определенной точкой его биографии, потому что в апреле он становится директором по науке Офиса прокурора Бруклина. Это часть Нью-Йорка, поэтому для Института прокуратуры, в партнерстве с которым, Наталья Сергеевна, спасибо, мы проводим это мероприятие. Это очень интересно, потому что когда вы увидите еще американского прокурора, будущий российский прокурор, увидели будущего американского прокурора. Значит, чувствуете себя свободно в плане вопросов. План такой, что у нас не более часа будет рассказ с презентацией, и после этого будет, по времени как 2 часа мы уложимся, да, и час вопросы и дискуссии. Дадим слово спикеру, не будем мозолить глаза. Спасибо, Олег.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for attending. I want to certainly thank Oleg and Daniel for inviting me here. I want to thank you guys for letting me give this presentation in English. I understand that I am in your country. I'm a visitor here, and yet I'm imposing a restriction of my language on you, so I thank you for allowing that. Throughout the presentation, just make sure that everybody's following with what I'm saying. I'll just check in and see, did you understand that? Are we good, or should I stop and answer any sort of questions or confusion? So when I ask, you can just give me a nod, and I know that everyone's telling me to go on. And if not, then I'll stop and pause for any sort of clarifications. Another thing I am going to ask you, so I know I'm already asking you to listen to me drone on in English. Also, I'm going to, as I'm talking, I tend to like to go a little bit off notes, right? Be a little bit informal. If there's a question that you have and it's a burning question, feel free to pose it. If you do it while I'm still talking, there's basically 3 responses that you'll get from me, all of them with respect, right? So one, if you ask a question and I know that it's necessary for everyone to understand that question before I move on, then I'll answer it then. If it's a question where I know that I'm going to answer it later, then I'll just let you know, oh, that's a good question, I'll answer it later. And then there are some questions that I might just say, hey, you should talk to me afterwards. And that'll be my way of making sure that I get enough people to talk to me afterwards. So I feel good about the presentation. Right? With that said, criminal justice, crime and punishment in the United States. Very glad that you all are interested in our system, and I'm going to try to do a couple of things as I present to you. So first is just going to be kind of going through some of the basic American principles around fair government in general, right? So this is not just the criminal justice system, but our governance system in general. And it's important for you to understand that because that is determining how our criminal justice system is set up. It's one of the things that has made the US government one of the more, unique government systems, right? A system that itself has been exported to lots of other countries or borrowed pieces of it. So it's a little complex, and I'm going to try to go through it. It's a lot of information. So again, any point where you're confused, stop me and we'll work through it together, right? I tend to feel pretty comfortable up in talking, but I want to make sure everybody else kind of feels comfortable too. So, like I said, feel free to stop me when we need to. I'm going to go through then, after talking about some of the principles of fair governance, talk a little bit about how the criminal justice system is set up, just give you a brief overview, or as brief as I can make it. It's kind of complex. I'll then go through a quick case study of how the system plays out in a particular topic, where we're seeing some of the flaws that arise in our system and how we're trying to deal with and resolve those flaws. Then I'll talk about the role of research in this and finish up just with thanking you guys and letting you know a little bit about some of the movement that's been taking place in the United States around public scholarship and having opportunities like this where researchers can talk to the public, right? Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce myself first. I'm a senior research manager for the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, MOCJ is what we call it in short. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that I do there a little later on in the presentation, but in general, my job is to work with and for the senior criminal justice advisor to the New York City mayor, who then gives a bunch of advice on how we can improve our criminal justice system. In some cases, our office is actually able to give money to do that. We're able to hire outside researchers to help us figure out how to improve the system. We're able to test criminal justice initiatives to make sure they're having the outcomes they're supposed to. So it's a whole range of activities that are taking place in that office, and some of the work that I do is just a small part of that. Before that, I did a bunch of other stuff too, so a list of things there, I won't get into all of it. But that includes, of course, having been a police officer for a few years in the United States. So anybody who has some questions about how we do policing from a more personal standpoint, let me know. Before that also, I went to law school, and while I've never formally practiced law, I've passed the bar and have the licenses. I sat in and took all those legal tests and stuff just like any of you guys. So if you want to talk a little bit about that at a point later on in the presentations, feel free. And finally, as Daniel mentioned, I believe I caught some of the words in Russian. As he mentioned, I am in a couple of months actually transitioning from the mayor's office and from my role as just one of many researchers in the mayor's office to the role as director of research for the Brooklyn prosecutor's office. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that and how that plays into the overall New York criminal justice system. All right. Okay, so we're good? Good to move? Okay, go ahead.
I didn't quite get, so you're now holding the position which is one, the local government.
Yes.
Yeah? And you are transiting to the federal government position.
It's also local government.
Also
Yep.
local.
Yep, also local government. And actually, that's good. So this is, you get to try out one of my responses. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that division in a little bit, so you'll see exactly where it fits in this really complex American system. Anything else I see? Okay, so principles of fair governance. So like all governments who set up a structure and a function, we in the United States had to answer at our founding the question, the kind of benchmark question for criminal justice folks is liberty or security, right? And the balance between the two. How do you make sure that government operates in an efficient way, that it actually is able to provide protection and safety for its people, that it's able to enforce its laws while also allowing its citizens to have the requisite amount of freedom, right? So we want you to be free to do what you want to do, except for some stuff, like we don't want you to be free to kill people, right? Or take my property. And so striking that balance has been a question that all governments have to face, that you all in Russia also have to face. And we tried to come up with a system that responded to those concerns. One, it's important to know when looking at the American system that it was founded at the end of a revolution in which the colonists were actually fighting against a British monarchy. And so at the time that they designed the United States Constitution, at the top of their minds was a system in which one person had the ability to essentially do what they want, right? The king over in the United Kingdom, specifically in the colonies, had the ability to basically issue orders for whatever he wanted to do. And in fact, if you know anything about how the British system is set up, they actually have a parliament, they have it today, and that protected British citizens who were in the United Kingdom from some of the potential abuses that could come from having a monarch, but that didn't actually protect the colonists. So they were actually coming out of an experience in which the king could do whatever he wanted. And if you think about that, then when you take a group of people who just fought a war to make sure that one person could never tell them what to do without protections, they designed a government that was built to ensure no one person could ever do that again. Now, I mean, depending on the time, people might critique how successful that system has been at stopping one or a few people from taking control of it. But for the most part, we've had a pretty good run in democracy over in the United States. And in part, it's because we have a bunch of different things built into our system to slow it down, to stop it from working, to restrain people's power, right? Sometimes that happens too efficiently, and so the big complaint actually with regard to our government is that we can't get things done because there's so much in the way of it. But one way that this has been described, this phenomenon, is really the idea of the assembly line versus an obstacle course, right? So you're designing a government, and you design a government to be as efficient as possible and move as quickly as possible, just kind of like an assembly line. Or do you design a government that's meant to be slow, that's meant to have a lot of input, that's meant to make it kind of hard to radically change things. You tend to have to change things in little pieces. And you do that by creating an obstacle course. So all throughout your government, you create these barriers that people have to overcome in order to change things or in order to institute some sort of government action, right? Again, this is a balance because in some cases it hurts you not to move fast and efficiently. If you have, for instance, just one person in charge, if there's a crisis, that person can say, do this is how we're going to address it, and it happens. In the United States, of course, that's not what happens. So when we have an emergency, a bunch of people have to agree on stuff, and until they do, nothing happens. So we have a lot of cases where our systems can break down at different points. And in some cases, people have seen that as a weakness. But also in many cases, it's that process of things being slowed down, of a lot of opinions being important, that's made it so that individuals like myself have been able to retain our freedom, right? Because a lot of people kind of have to agree before they can oppress us. There are 6 basic principles that we've used in order to establish this system. And one is, of course, the rule of law, that laws are more important than any one person's opinion or even a group of people's opinion. Separation of powers, so we created a pretty complex system where power is divided up amongst a bunch of different stakeholders. Federalism, which is another form of separation of powers, but it actually creates multiple levels of government. In fact, multiple governments that aren't even connected to each other, but yet are all controlling different parts of American citizens' lives. Democracy and republicanism, right? So we have within our system quite a few areas where direct voting and majority vote kind of wins, and so it makes sure that the population agrees with the thing. But then oftentimes the case is that people are represented. So you don't actually get to vote directly, you just have a representative. Discretionary power and checks and balances, and I'll talk a little bit about those later, but discretionary power, there's in our system lots of areas where officials are able to use their discretion legally to decide to either enforce an action or not, to take an action or not. And checks and balances really just refers to the principle that other pieces of government have ways of checking the overreach of a fellow aspect of government. And I'll explain that during this presentation. Let's talk about the first three of those. So our system has rule of law, and we start off with the Constitution. These are all kind of like very basic concepts, so I know you all probably follow me, but again, stop me if I hit something that's confusing. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so there's a lot of different laws that get passed, but our Constitution is the main one, the top one. And so nothing, of course, can be done that doesn't follow in accord with that Constitution. At the time that the framers of our Constitution came up with our Constitution, the idea was actually to create that obstacle course. So if you ever read the United States Constitution and you look through the process of changing that Constitution, oh my God, it's an incredibly difficult process, right? It has to pass by overwhelming majorities in both houses of our legislature. Then it has to go on to all the states, and a supermajority of the states actually have to ratify it. So they have to vote on it in their states. And all of those people have to agree before any changes can be made to this Constitution. So there's been several changes made to our Constitution, but not that many. And actually the last one happened some time ago. And so the whole system was designed that we set up these rules at the beginning of our country, and those have pretty much been the rules ever since. And no one really has the ability to change them very much. So you have to figure out how to work within them. And this was kind of designed in a way that it actually restricts power. So it makes sure that the rules of the game can't be changed during the game, right? Separate and primary legal powers were also split up. And again, this is all kind of probably basic stuff for you. But we have our legislatures, which are the places where laws are made. We actually have, both in the local level and within federal government, our executive branches responsible for enforcing the law, and then our judiciaries where laws are interpreted. And it was important to our founders to separate those powers, and again, those powers are separated in most countries around the world. But that's one way of ensuring that no one person, or certainly no small group of people, are easily able to take control of the government. And finally, federalism. So, like Russia, the United States is a federalist nation. And so our states are actually separate governments separate from the federal government. They have their own powers, their own jurisdictions, they can pass their own laws. They don't actually have to agree with the federal government. In fact, they don't have to cooperate with the federal government. I'm not sure how much you guys follow United States politics, but right now, in office, we have the president, and he's a member of the Republican Party, right? So that's a kind of conservative party within the United States. Again, I'm probably not telling you anything new. But I come from New York, and so anybody who's familiar with the states in the United States knows that New York is something of a more liberal government. So our state government virtually refuses to work with the federal government, like, entirely. And so there's this very interesting thing that is able to happen within the United States where you can have state governments that stand in opposition to the federal government. And so they don't commit any resources, for instance, to a lot of the federal programs. Federal government agencies have to establish their own presence within our state in order to get federal laws and things enacted that the state doesn't agree with, because we have the ability as state governments, as local governments, to decide whether we want to cooperate or not. Obviously, federal law must be followed, right? So no state governments are able to violate the law, but they don't have to commit resources to actually supporting federal priorities, right? So I'll try to give an example of this. In the United States, marijuana, the drug, is kind of there's an argument as to whether it should be legal or not. Currently, and I'll let you know a little bit using the topic of federalism, how this works in New York. Currently, under United States federal law, so the national criminal law, marijuana is an illegal substance. You can't have it for any purpose, medical or otherwise. You can be arrested for it, charged for it, go to jail for it. Right? It's a federal crime. In New York State actually doesn't think it should be a federal crime, so according to state law, actually you can use marijuana for medical purposes. And so this is a conflict here, right? In New York City, we think something even different, that you should be able to use marijuana whenever you want, for whatever purpose. And so according to our city laws, it's still technically a crime, but our mayor and for the most part, our police department has refused to ever enforce it. Right? So it's basically, it's not technically legal, but in practice, legal. So if you're in New York and you have marijuana and a cop walks up behind you and taps you on the shoulder, one of three things can happen. That cop can be a federal agent, and then you're probably going to jail. Or they can be a state police officer, and if you have some sort of medical marijuana card, then you're fine. If not, then you have some problems. But if it's a city officer, you can offer him something maybe. And so it's a patchwork of laws, right? Because in all those cases, you're one person in one place in New York, and there's three different sets of laws that are applying. But that was how our system was set up. And it was set up this way. Okay. It was set up this way really to make sure that power was distributed among a lot of stakeholders, right? So say if you start off with some big pot of power, and you take that pot and you divide it up into two bowls, one for individuals and one for government, right? And so here you have the power of individuals, the power of citizens, individual citizens like myself. And I have power in a lot of ways in our system. One, I have the power to vote with the rest of my individual citizen fellows to decide who gets to be in government. Also, we have in our Constitution this set of individual rights, the Bill of Rights, which says that I as an individual have certain freedoms, things that the government, no government, state or federal, can take from me, like the ability to say whatever I want, right? So I'm here in Russia, and I have the ability to say whatever I want, and my government can't punish me for it. None of the government, well, I work for the government, so I could lose my job depending on what I say, but nothing else, right? And so that means that individuals in our system actually have a good bit of power. Now the government, of course, has a lot of power too, right? We in the United States give our government the power to enforce laws, to put us in jail, to fine us. But we've done a pretty interesting thing, which is to take that government power and further divide it up. So if you have, say, a federal or national government pot of power, and then some of the state power, the federal government itself has power over only certain things. In fact, our Constitution does what's called, provides what's called enumerated rights. And the way our system is set up, that the federal government actually can't do anything unless they were specifically, or it was specifically given those powers by the United States Constitution. So if you read the United States Constitution, there's actually a list of things that the government is able to do. And if a thing is not on that list, the federal government can't actually do it. And this was a way of, again, restricting the power of the federal government. So all those things in that list are in this pot of federal government national power. And within that list, the power to do things on it are further divided by that separation of powers that we were talking about, right? So the federal executive, our president of the United States, the legislature, which itself is actually divided into two houses. So we have the United States Senate, and we have the United States House of Representatives. And in fact, they don't always agree, so oftentimes just to get things done there is quite difficult. Again, I don't know how closely you all follow United States politics, but right now, our House of Representatives, which is our lower legislative house, is in a different party than the Senate. So there's actually been not that many laws that have been able to be passed because those two houses can't agree. So they've not even been able to pass a law that then could go to the executive to be signed into law. Also, just interesting point, just talking about like separation of powers and freedoms. We'll talk about this a little bit in the checks and balances, but there's an interesting thing that just happened between our lower house, our upper house, right, the Senate, and our president. And I will explain a little bit about how that works in just a little bit. Okay. Just to also touch base on this, state governments also are divided up in these three ways, right? So New York, for instance, has a governor. We have two state houses in New York, actually. The state Senate and New York's General Assembly. And then it also has its own set of courts. All right, so do I need to stop and clarify anything? Are we good to move on? All right. Okay, so this is a lot of words. I'm going to walk you through it. Representation, right? Republic versus democracy. So republicanism, again, is this idea that the population is represented by representatives that the people elect. And this is the major characteristic of our government. So actually, our legislators are the people who pass laws. Individuals like myself don't get to vote on those laws. We get to vote on those laws by voting for our representatives. So we have to vote for the representative, make sure that we get the right person in, and then that person we expect will vote in the way that we want in order to pass laws. An interesting point of fact, most elected people are elected in the United States directly by people like me, but our president is actually elected in even a different system. So I don't actually get to directly vote for whether we want a president, right? And so there's not this thing that's called like a national popular vote where the majority wins. That's actually not how we decide our president. We actually decided through this process, and it's so quirky and difficult that I won't explain it here tonight, or you can talk to me separately about it. But we have this electoral college, and it's actually this collection of essentially points, right, a group of people who represent the various states, and states are given a different number of people depending on how big they are and how many people that they have within them, and it's actually that group that represents us and represents our votes when they choose a president. But the way that it's set up, you take a population of a state and you kind of divide it up, but there are some states that have really, really large populations, like New York. And then there's some states, some you may not have even heard of, like South Dakota, because a lot of people, even in the United States, haven't heard of South Dakota, or Kansas, or any of these places, Kentucky. And these places actually have smaller populations, but they still get a certain amount of electoral votes. So voters in some of those places, the power of their vote actually represents a much smaller amount of people than the power of electoral votes within New York, where one electoral vote represents maybe millions of folks. Because of that, you get interesting things like, for instance, I don't know if you guys know this, but back in 2016, when we elected our last president, the national popular vote, right, actually meant that Hillary Clinton, who was the Democratic nominee, won. And she actually got 3 million, I think, approximately, more votes than Donald Trump. But the Electoral College, and because of how it's divided up into a point system, he actually won the Electoral College, which is why he's our president. So this is an example of republicanism, right? Because in that case, you can't really say it was a democratic process, because the majority actually selected somebody else. But it was a Republican process. So the majority got to vote for a set of representatives, and depending on how that formula worked out, it actually determined a winner, which was different than the popular vote. But there are cases where democracy, right, majority vote, wins. Usually in most elections, it's majority wins, right? You can win by one vote. In fact, just in our last, I think it was, the 2017 elections in Virginia, one of the elections was so close that it was actually, there was a tie, there was a vote tie. And they broke it by flipping a coin. That was what Virginia law said. You flip a coin, so they flipped the coin. And it turned out, actually, that in the Virginia state legislature, there was also basically a tie. And so whoever won this election, whichever party had a candidate that won that election, that party would be in control of that house in the Virginia government. I think that was the Senate, in fact. And whoever won that election was decided by this coin vote, or this coin flip. And so the party that ultimately won, the Republicans, got to control the Virginia State Senate based really on a coin flip, right? And so this is this system of direct election. In some cases, state governments also have processes of like referendums. So there are some cases in which laws can actually be voted on by the general public. In California, this happens all the time, in fact. And so that's one example where majority actually rules, and the majority of people directly, people like myself, can actually vote on something that becomes a law. Okay, I know that was like a lot, but are we good? We're still following? Discretionary power also plays an important role in our government. So within our legislative system, for instance, they have discretion on what laws to write and when, right? And so that is kind of the power of the choice of the legislators. There's no other group that can tell them what to vote on or when. So even if our president really wants something passed, and he currently has wanted a lot of things to be passed, it's up to our legislator to decide if to vote on it, and if to vote on it, when to vote on it. The president, though, in our federal government, and executives in our state governments also have some discretion. So they get to decide, for instance, how to enforce laws. So we have a number of immigration laws in place in the United States, and some presidents, like President Obama, have decided to be very lenient in how to enforce those laws. And then some presidents, like President Trump, have decided to enforce those laws with gusto, very excitedly. And that's entirely their choice. And so it's the same laws. The laws haven't changed. It's just whether the executive is excited about enforcing those laws or not. And this happens across laws, so laws on healthcare, laws on immigration, laws on workforce development or environmental protections. All of these can be dramatically impacted by who the executive is and how strongly they feel like enforcing that particular set of laws. Because resources are limited. You only have so many people, you only have so much money, and the executive actually has the ability to decide where they want to commit those resources. Finally, there's judicial discretion, which is around which cases to consider and when. People in the United States don't really pay much attention to this, but it becomes very important, for instance, with our Supreme Court. So our Supreme Court actually only hears, about 200 cases or so a year, but there are a lot of cases that where people ask for the Supreme Court to review their case. Excuse me. And in most cases, the Supreme Court actually just says no, right? And so in the cases where the Supreme Court says no, that just remains this set of laws where there's some sort of case or dispute that may still have some outstanding unsettled issues. And our court never actually answers those things because it's just decided to focus on another case, right? So this is one case where judicial discretion is important in our system. Just to get back to this checks and balances, and tell you a little bit about this story I was referring to earlier. But for instance, our legislator has several different ways in which it can check the power of other areas of our government. So for instance, it approves or confirms high-level officials. There was actually a big issue that came up in the United States a couple years ago. Our Supreme Court has 9 members of it currently. And so recently, one of the members died. This was when President Obama was still in office, so this is approximately 2015. And President Obama, the president has the ability, as I note here, to actually nominate judicial officers. So our president, at the time, President Obama, nominated a Supreme Court justice, but that person had to be confirmed by the legislature, in this case, in the federal case, the United States Senate, and the House doesn't get to vote on it, it's just the Senate. And the Senate at that time was controlled by the opposite party, the Republicans. And so they decided that they just weren't going to vote on confirming that judicial person. So the seat was just empty. Well, and then you guys know kind of what happened, right? Then you had a presidential election, and President Trump got elected, and he's a Republican, and the Senate was controlled by Republicans, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, we really should confirm somebody for that seat that's open. So he nominated someone, and they got confirmed very, very quickly. And that's kind of a way in which you have checks and balances, right? So that's an example where the Senate, under President Obama, denied his ability to be able to put in a judicial officer of his choice. And that process makes it so that presidents can't just stack the court with whoever they want. They can be stopped by the legislature. Executives, oh wait, I don't want to skip this part. Legislatures also in our system have the ability to do what's called impeach and possibly remove executive and judicial officers. And this is very important. Again, not sure how closely you guys follow our politics, but this actually just happened on the federal level. So what happens is our House of Representatives, our lower legislative house, has the ability to do what's called impeach an official. Really, it's just to draw up a set of articles and vote to approve, where they essentially indict that officer, right? They bring up charges against them. And then they send those charges to the upper house, to our United States Senate. And it's the Senate's job to sit as a jury and to decide whether to convict that officer and remove them from office. The House can do this with all high-level officers, including the president. And so they just did that. Right? Donald Trump was impeached, actually, just a few months ago, just back in December, where our House actually voted to charge him with two different charges. Just so you know, the House is controlled by Democrats and have been looking for a way to charge Donald Trump with something for some time. I'm not sure if you guys know, but we were looking very closely at some of his involvement with people here in Russia to try to figure out if there was some way to do that. We ended up settling on some things that he was doing with Ukraine, and so charges were brought up. But it went up to the Senate, and the Senate decided not to convict him, right? So Donald Trump is still in office. But that's a pretty big check, right? What I just told you is that up until, I think it's last week, Donald Trump didn't know whether he was going to be removed from office. Our system has the ability to take even the most powerful office in our system and remove that person without him being able to do anything. It's an incredibly powerful check on the power of the executive, right? An incredibly important power within our government. Executives can themselves also produce checks and balances. They can, for instance, help control the judiciary because they get to decide who gets nominated to be a judge. So you don't even get to be a judge unless the executive nominates you, at least in our federal system. That's maybe a little bit different in some of the state and local systems. But executives also have the power to veto legislative acts, right? So it can pass the legislature, and then executives have the power to say, no, we disagree with this law, take that back. Then the legislature has the power to override that veto, right? Overrule it, but in order to do so, they have to have what's called a supermajority. A large group of them have to all get together and vote to overrule the president. And as I just described to you guys, you know, Americans like to argue. We argue about all sorts of stuff. We don't agree on a lot of things. The thing that makes us Americans, and you know, I'm from New York, so the thing that really makes us New Yorkers, is having our own opinion. I have my own opinion on all sorts of stuff I don't even know about yet. You ask me a question, and I'm instantly going to have an opinion about it. And so it's really difficult to get these super majorities within the legislature. So usually if the president won't sign a law, it usually just doesn't become law because the legislature is never able to agree enough to override that. The judiciary has an incredibly important power to check the other two branches by invalidating laws as not being constitutional. Our judges are the places where our laws get interpreted. So once legislatures write laws, for instance, they don't get to say anything else about it. The judges take over and they get to interpret what the law actually means. And in fact, many judges refuse to even listen to what the legislatures thought they meant. So you could be a legislator in the United States. You can write a law and think it says one thing, and a case comes up, and the judge looks at it and says, oh, I'm reading these words you wrote. I think it means this other thing. And so that's what it means. Right? The judge can't write a law, so that they can't create laws, but they get to interpret the laws that legislators create. So that becomes a major check on the legislatures to make sure that they have to be very careful about how they write our laws. And they can invalidate, judges, can invalidate actions of the executive too, right? So actually I was telling you earlier about how excited Donald Trump was, our President Trump was, to enforce immigration laws, but actually immediately as he got those laws, or as he began to put in place the ways that he was going to enforce those laws, people started challenging him from all over the country in court. And in many cases, courts overturned his actions, told him that it was illegal, unconstitutional to do many of the things he was trying to do, right? And so this is one way that the American people are able to check the power of our executives, our president, through our legislator. By the way, in our federal system, our judiciary, our judges, once they're selected and confirmed by the legislature, they actually have their position for life, right? So, for instance, I think our oldest justice is in her 90s at this point. And for people who really agree with her position on the law, they pray every day that she just stays alive and keeps voting on things how she does. And she has a position on a lot of issues that is very different from what our current president would like, and yet he can never remove her. Right? Yes. And so this is, again, an incredibly important thing, an incredibly important aspect. During the Obama administration, so when President Obama was in office, lots of his laws got challenged. And he actually, on the Supreme Court, most of the people on the Supreme Court, the majority, actually tended not to agree with a lot of his things, right? So many of his programs were always, it was a kind of a question as to whether they would actually be held up because they were challenged so much in court. So it was an important check. Just moving on, I know that I'm probably talking a little long here. But state governments can also challenge federal actions. Federal governments can preempt state laws, right? Take over state laws. And individuals can elect legislators and executives. All right, so I'm gonna move along pretty briskly now in the second part, so I'm gonna make sure that you guys get a chance to ask questions. But that first part was pretty important because it set up the whole foundation for everything I'm about to say now. All right, so in our American system, just like every other criminal justice system, we have criminal laws, which are enacted by the legislature. Police and prosecutors get to actually enforce those laws. Criminal courts are the places where those cases that the prosecutors and police actually enforce, this is where they actually get heard and decided. And then if you're convicted and you're convicted to incarceration, you go to a jail or a prison. We have our separation of powers, right? Our different systems takes place here in our criminal justice system. So actually, it's not really appropriate to say the American criminal justice system because we don't have one. We have a bunch of criminal justice systems. Right? So we have the federal criminal justice system, a state system, and oftentimes a local criminal justice system as well. Right? And all of those different governments have their own abilities to enforce laws, sometimes, again, as I was saying about the marijuana example, in contradiction to each other. So, here's an example of how that system works in New York. And I told you it was a complicated system, and you can see it is. Right? So let me see if I can walk you through this really quick. Right? So on the federal level, as I was saying, you have the US Senate and the House of Representatives, and they're the ones who are passing criminal laws. Right? On the state level, you have our state Senate and state assembly, and they are passing criminal laws too. And then at the local level, you have our city council, the New York City Council, and they too are passing laws. So as a New York citizen, I have these three sets of laws. All these people who are coming up with the criminal laws that I have to know and be aware of, right? So, for instance, according to these folks, marijuana is illegal all the time. According to these folks, marijuana is legal if you have a medical issue. According to these folks, marijuana is fine whenever. Right? And then the laws passed by these folks actually get enforced by these groups. Right? So on the law enforcement area, you have a bunch of different agencies, like the FBI, you guys have probably heard of, the ATF, DEA, and then on the prosecutorial level, you have U.S. attorneys. ATF. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Yeah, so this is, when people, DEA is the Drug Enforcement Administration. So when people talk about federal law enforcement, because we have so many different agencies, they call it just the alphabet soup of federal law enforcement. I have et cetera here, because those are not the only law enforcement agencies on the federal level. It's like a lot of them. But these are the main ones, right? And then prosecutors, right? So of course these are the lawyers who get to decide which cases, which arrests to actually bring into court and prosecute. And those are the U.S. attorneys on the federal level. On the state level, you have the same things. We have state police and a bunch of other state agencies that can enforce things. And then we have an attorney general's office, right? So kind of like the U.S. attorneys getting to decide which cases to actually bring. They don't usually do like low-level criminal cases, but the attorney general does have some prosecutorial powers. And on a local level, we have our local police, right? Like the New York Police Department, NYPD, a pretty famous police department. A police department that has approximately 20,000 uniformed police officers. There are about 37,000 people who work for that agency by itself. And then you have the district attorneys. So New York, the city is so big that it actually includes 5 different counties. These are these large administrative divisions, and each of them have their own district attorneys, so their own prosecutor offices that are deciding which of the arrests from NYPD they're actually going to take into court. And when they do, they take it over here to these local courts. So here you see a weird little box. The state of New York has a unified court system, so there's the same courts for state and local cases. There are no separate local courts. I mean, there are, but very specialized courts. Mostly, there are these state supreme courts that everything goes to. So, Attorney General's action goes there, District Attorney's action goes there, and then if there's an appeal, it goes up to the Court of Appeals, right? We also have 2 federal courts within the city of New York, too. So we have the Eastern District, which includes 2 of our New York counties, and then some other New York State counties. And then the Southern District, which includes the other 3, and then a couple of other New York State counties, right? And then we have our different jail systems. So in New York, we have a bunch of different jails, not a ton, but more than you would think, right? There's the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which is a federal prison. And actually, I work very closely to this building. It looks pretty nice from the outside, but you wouldn't want to go in there. There's a Lincoln Correctional Facility and Rikers Jail, which is actually very famous. We're in the process now of trying to build another set of jails because it's so old and it's kind of a terrible construction. When?
About jail and prison. What is the difference?
Oh yes. Okay, so when we say jail in the American system, we just mean a place where you're held temporarily. So before you actually are convicted. Pre-trial detention, thank you. Or if you have a sentence of 1 year or less, right? Or really less than 1 year. Yep. That's jail, right? It's meant to be kind of temporary. Yeah, and in any sort of criminal conviction that's over a year, you leave the local system and you go up to the state jail, right? Or sorry, the state prison. And so prison is for, I guess, what people consider to be more hardened criminals, right? More serious criminals, people who do crimes where they're charged for a year or more in incarceration. Yes, yes, they do. So this particular prison is a minimum security prison, I believe. It's in New York City, but up in our state, in some of the more rural areas, we have our medium security prisons, maximum security prisons. And the federal level, they have a super max category. So like a really, really secure facility where essentially if you're arrested there, you almost don't really have much contact with other humans except for the guards with guns. Okay, I know that this was a lot of information, probably a lot of questions coming out of this system. I just want to move on to one last thing before I really open it up to questions and give you the case study I was talking about. Right? So when does our system fail? Well, with all these obstacles in the way that are supposed to protect individual freedoms, there have been some pretty famously documented cases where our system seems not to work so well. And there are still areas that we have to improve. And so it's very interesting, actually, that I'm here and I'm talking to you about the American criminal justice system, because as a Black American, I'm in a unique position of being a member of a group that has historically been disproportionately captured in the criminal justice system, right? And so when we talk about the fairness of the system, for me, this is a pretty personal topic. I even have family members and people that I know who have gone through the federal and state systems. And so looking at ways of making it fairer is incredibly personal to me. I mean, it's something that we get to do a lot at my job. You can see, for instance, New York City's population itself is about 27% Black, right? Folks look like me. 27% Hispanic or Latinx, and approximately 45% white. But if you remember back here, Rikers Jail is our local jail, right, for people serving 1 year below or pretrial detention. It actually holds on any given day a little over 7,000 people, I think, is what we're up to right now. And again, that's just temporary holding just in New York City. So you can see the United States really has always had, and certainly in the last several decades, an issue with mass incarceration and putting way too many of our citizens in jail. In that jail population of approximately 7,000 people, 56% are Black, 33% Latinx and Hispanic, only 7.5% white. As you can see, those two numbers, as they're on top of each other, don't really look similar. And there are certain groups that are really overrepresented in our jail system, right? So that is actually one of the areas that we've been working on trying to improve within our New York criminal justice system.
Well, is the jail operated by state or private company?
It's operated by the city.
But so you also have private jails and prisons?
We do. In the United States, yes. If you didn't hear the question, he was asking about private correctional systems. And we do have them. We don't have them operating in New York. But the federal government actually has a number of contracts with private systems, and many, many states have contracts with private correctional systems. Rikers itself is actually controlled by and run by the city, but there are cases where there are correctional systems that are run privately. Let's see. Okay, so just to run through, there are a couple different ways in which that can happen, right? And so there's all these different actors and people where unfairness and racial bias can show up. For instance, sometimes you can pass a law that can have a disproportionate impact on one group of people. So say, for instance, there's a group of people who likes to use marijuana, and then there's a group of people who like to smoke some other type of drug. The city council could potentially be unfair if it chose to outlaw one type of drug that one group likes, but allow another type of drug that another group likes. This actually happened on a federal level in the case of, for instance, the drug cocaine. So historically in the United States, white people liked powder cocaine. And poor folks usually had this boiled down, hard rock type of cocaine called crack. And so the federal laws actually punished crack at one point almost 100 times worse than the same amount of cocaine. And remember, they're both the same, right? Crack is just kind of like boiled down cocaine. It's the same drug, but one group likes it in this form and the other group likes it in this other form. And the laws treat those forms differently, and that's one way in which you can have this unfairness, this bias that happens on the lawmaking side, right? From the prosecutorial side, cops, for instance, get to decide who they're gonna arrest, who they're gonna stop. And so if they stop more black people, and when they stop those people, they decide to arrest them more, you can have unfairness in the system even where there are similar levels of activity. For instance, people who have studied drug use in the United States found that white folks and black folks use, say, marijuana about the same rates, actually. But black folks are much more likely to be arrested for it because it is illegal in most places, and cops stop black people more. So if you're white in the United States, you can probably get away with the crime, but if you're black, you're not. So that's another way where you see unfairness. On the court system side, there's the types of charges that get through the court system and the types of sentences that are given out. And that all ends up, at the end of it all, with more people of one group that are in jail than should be, given their proportion of the population, even given their proportion of the crime-committing population. So just a couple things. Here's an example where you see some of the difference. Percent of drivers stopped by police in 2011, this is a national study, white drivers, black drivers in their study, and Hispanic drivers, right? So in this particular study, you're seeing that there's a difference in how likely you are to be stopped based on what race you are. So that means you could be doing the same thing if you're white, black, or Hispanic, but if you're black or Hispanic, you have a much higher chance of being caught and punished for it. When prosecutors decide to bring cases, they also, national studies have shown, tend to offer different options to the different groups differently, right? So black defendants, for instance, are offered jail time as part of a plea deal much more frequently than white folks are, right? And so that means if you're only offered the option of less jail time, but you're still going to go to jail no matter what, then you're more likely to see more black people in jail, right? Naturally. I can go through this, I'll just kind of skip through this. Detention status after arraignment. So if you get where you're pre-trial, you can be allowed out, right? You can be allowed back home and then you just have to come to court when your case is heard, or they can hold you pre-trial in jail. Actually, black defendants are much more likely to be held in jail than white defendants are. This is a court decision. Juries who get to decide whether a person is convicted or not are made up of regular American citizens, usually approximately 12 of them. And prosecutors have this tool where they can actually excuse or ask for certain jurors to be removed from the jury, meaning that those jurors don't get a chance to help decide if someone gets convicted. Well, blacks are actually much more likely to be removed from juries, where the prosecutor can just ask, hey, this person, I don't know, they're a teacher, I don't like teachers, can we take them off the jury? And that happens much more often with black jurors. I said that in a joking way, but actually in most systems, prosecutors are given a certain number of kind of unchallengeable removals. They can just remove a person for basically no reason at all. And so I think in the federal system and most state systems, about 5 times they can just remove 5 jurors. The prison sentences are often also distributed differently. What we do in the mayor's office is focusing on trying to impact that problem, to resolve that problem really on the local level. So the mayor's office of criminal justice works with the mayor and city council to get better laws passed. We work with the police department and with district attorneys in order to examine how they do their decision-making, how they're offering pleas, what cases they decide to bring to make the system much fairer. We work with the courts to try to improve their systems, make them fairer, more efficient, and also have even worked with the correctional system, including our project to remove Rikers Jail. So right now, we actually have worked with City Council to pass a law that closes down Rikers Jail in the future, and we'll now have 4 smaller jails in its place, which will be much more modern and much more humane. My own work has actually worked on some of this stuff. So I've worked on the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety, which is a kind of public service program. I'll give you a few more details about that in just a few minutes. But I've also been able to work on a study of our court system, particularly the buildings and the way judges treat defendants in order to incorporate what's called procedural justice, so just fairer processes. And I've been able to be a member of the Justice Implementation Task Force, which is the task force that's responsible for helping to plan how we get rid of Rikers Jail. I'm actually on the architectural group in that task force, and so I've been able to participate in conversations about how to design a jail that's more humane, that's safer, that's helps rehabilitate or teach people the lessons that they need to learn, I guess, but also does it in a way that is dignified and still respects them as human beings. The main part of my job these days is actually on MAP, this Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety. And it's this program where we've selected a couple of areas in the city to get that had really high crimes, and we put a bunch of money in giving them a bunch of social services, right? So these are things to help them if they're having trouble paying their rents. These are educational programs, jobs building programs, or job skills development programs. We've also done a number of things with public space. So in some of our poorer areas, the buildings were crummy, the parks and things were in bad shape, and so we put a lot of money to improving those spaces. And then created processes for participatory government. So created processes where the citizens who live in those areas get a chance to participate in the decision-making that takes place for what happens in those areas. And my research helps those programs really in 4 major ways. One, I'm responsible for data analysis. So I'm responsible for looking over numbers and making sure, or providing them a picture of what's happening in those neighborhoods. I'm responsible for overseeing program evaluation. So we work with a lot of outside university researchers to come in and test, maybe do studies to see if this program is actually working to reduce crime. And if so, how? Why? What are the pieces of it? I help us design our performance management systems, right? So I sit down with policymakers and say, hey, you have this program, you think that this stuff will stop or reduce crime, tell me how. And now we're gonna come up with ways of measuring whether that's actually happening and whether you're getting better and better at it or worse and worse. And then I give policy advice. So a lot of my job is just reading a bunch of studies from all over the world to figure out what are the best ideas in criminal justice, and then be able to sit down with policymakers and say, oh, hey, you guys want to design a new jail? Well, in the Netherlands, they have like really beautiful jails, and here's some studies that show that those jails are like this, and you might want to consider some of their designs in the new jails that we have here. In the future, I will be working particularly in this area of the criminal justice system, right, with the Brooklyn Attorney's Office, District Attorney's Office. That's Kings County, because actually it's the County Attorney's Office. But you can call it Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for short. And there I'll be helping the prosecutor, particularly in looking at ways to use his prosecutorial discretion to improve the system. So actually the Brooklyn District Attorney has done a lot of things. For instance, he's told the New York Police Department that he refuses to prosecute any marijuana crimes at all. So while marijuana is widely legal in New York City, right, like we just refuse to enforce it, there are a couple of caveats, like a couple of different things. For instance, you can't smoke it in public. So you can have it, but you just can't smoke it in public. However, in some communities, people don't have a lot of public space, right? In poorer places, they don't really have, like a big house or places where they have to smoke it, so they have to do it outside. And then cops may decide to stop them and issue them a citation. Well, in Brooklyn, the prosecutor said, sure, we can't do anything about the police arresting you, right? Because the prosecutor doesn't control the police, so they can arrest you. But then when it comes to the prosecutor's office, and we have to decide whether we're going to take it into court to take it to jail, the prosecutor said no. So police officers, you can arrest them if you want, but then I'm just going to release them later. I'm just going to keep doing that until you stop arresting them. And the prosecutor is able to do that across a bunch of different levels. And so my job will be to help him decide a little bit on how to decide what to prosecute. When you prosecute something, which charges do you go for, right? Do you go for the harshest charge, or do you go for a more lenient charge? What sentence to seek, right? Do you seek the maximum punishment or more lenient punishments, and how to use research to do that. All right, finally, I'll finish up, and I went a little bit over what I wanted to talk to about by about 15 minutes. I'm gonna rush through this a little bit. But public scholarship is also an important part, not only of my job at New York City, but it should be an important part of what all researchers do, even when they work in a university, is how do we take the work that we do and bring it to the public, bring it to forums like this, right? So I know that we have a lot of students here, but it's also open for just regular Russian citizens. And this is designed to teach you a little bit about how systems in either in your country works, right? So you can have Russian scholars come here and to do these lectures open to the public so that regular, average Russians can know more about how their system works. In the United States, I get a chance to do this in a lot of communities where, I'm able to help citizens understand a little bit more about how their system works. And this should be done really under the name of what we've called, at least in a lot of literature now, informational justice, right? So there's actually a set of principles of justice that comes with information and how information and knowledge should be treated. One is that seekers should have equal access to knowledge. So you should make knowledge widely available. If you're a government source, you should publish your data so that people can study it, right? So that citizens know, oh wow, I didn't know that we had 7,000 people in Rikers. I want to go tell the city council to bring that down, or I'm going to vote them out, right? But you wouldn't know that as a voter unless the city government published that information and told you, hey, just so you know, we have 7,000 people in jail. So having access to that information empowers regular citizens. We also want to make sure that we respect our sources of information. Researchers do a lot of research where, for instance, they sit down with folks and gather information in in-depth interviews or collect a lot of personal information. We want to make sure that we respect and think about the ethical issues that are involved in that, right? But also respect the fact that we too can be sources of information. And so information should be bi-directional. We take information away from our subjects, we sit down and we do a bunch of interviews, for instance, with prisoners. What are ways that we can give information back to those same prisoners? They helped us so much, we should be giving something back to them. Right? And that gets into a little bit about respecting the subjects of research. And that gets not only into giving information back to them, but to being truthful and ethical in how you represent them in your research. So for instance, even today, I'm here in Russia and I'm talking about the American criminal justice system. And it's important that I represent to you in truth what it actually is. That I tell you about the good parts of our system and some places where it's flawed, but that I don't do it in a biased way out of respect for the system that I'm studying. I told you a little bit about the case of African Americans in the criminal justice system. And again, it's important that I convey to you a truthful picture of that. As a researcher who's been entrusted with that information, it's important that I hold that information as sacred, right? And so that when I'm expressing it to other folks who are learning from me about another group of people who don't get to stand here and talk about themselves to you, that I represent them accurately, right? And that's an important part of what we call informational justice. With that, thank you. And I can take some questions.
Thank you for your lecture. And actually I want to ask you to describe some of the peculiarities of prosecutor's office in the United States. I think it will be of use for us to compare the Russian prosecutor office system and the system of United States. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll admit, I'm not as well versed in the Russian prosecutorial system. So if you pick up some areas that you think may particularly be of interest, let me know, and maybe you can teach me a little bit about the system too. But one thing that I'm not sure if you guys elect your prosecutors, let me know if that's the case. Okay. So on the the local level, right, the Brooklyn district attorney, for instance, is directly elected. So in some cases, for instance, the reason why our Brooklyn District Attorney's Office has to go to the police and say, hey, I'm not going to prosecute these crimes is because he's actually more liberal on this than the mayor is, who I currently work for, right? So my future boss actually disagrees with my current boss, and you can have that because the prosecutor is not hired by the mayor. The prosecutor is directly elected and holds his position outside of that, right? So that's kind of an important part of our system there. The other thing is, the way our system works, as I was just describing, prosecutors have great discretion to decide what to do with their cases, right? To decide whether to prosecute a case if it's brought to arrest or not. And there's no way of challenging that. There's no challenge to that. So if the police arrest and conduct an investigation, and they make an arrest that they think is a really good case, and the prosecutor decides, I don't think it is, there's nothing the police can do to ever bring that up. There's nothing that the courts can do to bring it into court without the prosecutor, right? And so the prosecutor actually has been described as the most powerful office in the American criminal justice system merely because it can invalidate all arrest if it wants from the police department, and also gets to decide what gets in the court. So a judge may never have a case unless a prosecutor decides to actually bring it. Is that any question about what I just said before I move on?
It's connected.
Okay.
Who pays the salary? Who pays the salary
To the prosecutor.
Does anybody?
So that's So he asked who pays the salary of the prosecutors.
And who elects?
Okay.
Yes.
Who elects the prosecutors and who pays their salary?
Yes.
So again, prosecutors are directly elected, right? So popularly elected by the people, right? So in Brooklyn, these are actual Brooklyn residents, not the whole city of New York, just the Brooklyn part of it. They get to vote for that prosecutor. They vote for them just like they vote for the mayor. And so our prosecutor actually goes out, he shakes hands and kisses babies and asks for your vote. And that's how the prosecutor gets elected. And in fact, right now, the Brooklyn prosecutor is pretty popular in Brooklyn, so it looks like he'll be elected, even though some of the people, particularly the police department, actually don't always favor some of the policies that he's enacted. And so you can see there an example of how direct popular election works its way in the criminal justice system to create some checks and balances. So that's popular election. When elected, they are paid, there's two important parts of that. So the salary of the prosecutor comes from the city budget, and that provides another bit of a check because it's actually the city council that approves the city budget. Right? And this comes from taxes, tax money. So ultimately, people like me, the citizens are paying all these salaries, right? But the city council gets to decide what the budget is. So the city council can't remove the district prosecutor if they don't agree, but they could, for instance, restrict the prosecutor's office's budget. But then there's some other cases, some other funding tools too, where prosecutors' offices can get money. For the most part, that's coming from the city budget, though.
Is it an independent institution or is part of system of prosecutors?
So no, all of the prosecutors' offices are independent, right? So there's no overarching authority.
So no vertical.
No. So for instance, we have 5 counties in New York City, which means we have 5 prosecutors' offices, and they don't all agree either. So depending on which county you are in, the prosecutor may be, say, more conservative. So there are a couple counties within New York, I won't list them, they're on tape. There are a couple counties here in New York where people know, that prosecutor's office, they prosecute stuff all the time. And so you're more likely to be caught there. Where there are other counties that say, hey, we want to do criminal prosecution in a different way. We want to be more lenient. All of those prosecutors are directly elected, right? So the people in Manhattan elect the Manhattan district prosecutor. The people in the Bronx elect the Bronx prosecutor, and so on and so forth. And they can disagree or not agree, and there's no one above them who can enforce any policy on them. So it's all up to that prosecutor.
And the general prosecutor also elected or not?
Like the Attorney General? The Attorney General is okay. So the State Attorney General in New York is also an elected position. And so, for instance, in New York State, very recently, we had an attorney general that often, almost like my boss in the city, my future boss in the city, was seen as much more liberal than the actual governor. And so the attorney general constantly disagreed with the governor. In fact, in some cases, investigated things that the governor was doing. And he didn't have to answer to the governor because the attorney general in the state is elected. On the federal level, that's different. On the federal level, the attorney general is appointed by the president and serves, in fact, at the pleasure of the president. So can essentially be fired whenever the president decides that he's not happy with their job. So our current U.S. Attorney General is Bill Barr, and he's been critiqued a lot because, as I was just telling you, the House of Representatives that the Democrats control on the federal level has wanted to do a ton of investigations of President Trump and the things that he's been doing. They've been asking for a lot of different documents, and in many cases, the president and people working for him have refused to give over those documents. And the Democrats in the House of Representatives have been critiquing our current Attorney General, who has the power to use the law to force those agencies to produce those documents, but he would have to go against his boss. Now, even though the Attorney General can be removed by the President, the United States has had a tradition, typically, where the President picks his Attorney General and then lets them do whatever they want. They just kind of agreed that, hey, I know that I hired you, but I hired you to kind of keep me in check. So while I'm your boss, I still would like you to be able to do the things that maybe I don't like sometimes. Our current President, according to a lot of observers, doesn't really agree with that style of leadership. And so he's perhaps been seen in some cases as having a attorney general that's much more in line with how he thinks on matters. And so has been unwilling really to do a lot of these internal investigations that the House Democrats have requested, right? So that could be a bad thing or a good thing, right? In some cases, people might argue that the House Democrats are just trying to use the courts to do political things, which they really should be doing in elections and not the court. And on the other side, the Democrats would say, oh, I think that actually the presidential administration is doing some things that may not be entirely legal, and so we should investigate those things. But on that in the federal case, that's all decided by a person who's appointed by the president. That's the back.
Thank you for your lecture. I want to ask about, you said 56% of prisoners are black in the jails. What's the reason of that? The blacks are doing more crimes than whites, or the whites getting right from their crimes?
That's you from Afghanistan.
So this is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's actually really, really complex. In fact, I could have given an entire hour-long lecture just on that. Right? If you look objectively at the crimes that we think we have the best data on, right? And I say that because it's actually very difficult to have accurate crime data. Most of our data about crimes, right, so numbers of crimes, is actually generated by the police. We are able to understand what crime happens based on what police report and based on their arrest reports. That's not entirely an unbiased way of getting crime, though, because it means that if the police don't see it and record it, it basically never happened. But we know that there are lots of crimes that occur that are never counted. I say that because when you look at crime numbers, they are higher for African Americans. That may reflect the fact that they commit more crimes in those areas. Maybe, we're not sure. African Americans are disproportionately living in poor, more disadvantaged places. And so we know that poverty tends to help be a good predictor of doing more crime. And other things like lack of education or lack of jobs also helps predict whether a person's going to commit crime. And those things are higher in the African American community, so it could be that they are committing more crimes, and perhaps because of those reasons. But because our crime data comes from the police and from them arresting folks, it also could be that we just have more police in the African American community, so more crimes get discovered, so more crimes get reported, so those crime numbers seem higher. Where if we had the same amount of police in white neighborhoods, they would catch more of the crimes, then they could arrest for more of those crimes, then they could record more of those crimes, and then the crimes would be higher in those white communities too. So it's actually difficult to say exactly how much difference there is in the crime that's being committed. What we can say for sure is that crimes are detected, people are arrested, and crimes are prosecuted at a much higher rate within the African American community. Again, there are a lot of different potential explanations for that. Whole careers are designed just to try to answer that question.
Maybe, but in your opinion, black people break the laws more often than white, in your opinion? Like, not about statistic in your. I know that white people can avoid the jail. I understand, but in your opinion, who break the law more often?
You're gonna lock me down, huh? I'm gonna try to refer back to some of my legal training and see if there's some way for me to weasel out of this. You know, I'm not going to give you a very direct answer, and that's in part because I really just can't. So I'm not me trying to avoid it, but there's really no way of knowing. In my opinion, though, so some crimes are, like, again, we have pretty good data on, like, homicides. A person gets killed, and usually that gets noticed. You can't hide a body, or if you do, usually someone notices that that person is missing. So those numbers we think are probably accurate, right? Like those homicide numbers are usually not numbers that were made up by the police, or it's only because the police found it more here than there. And so on those numbers, yeah, the more homicides are committed by African Americans.
But in drugs and other, you think it's not true? Or
research has tended to show that, and this depends on the drug, right? So there are different levels of drug use across groups. But overall, drug use tends to be similar across those groups, and yet one group is punished for it more. I do believe that there is more parity, more equality in drug usage between African Americans and whites. Again, I don't have the direct statistics to say that, but I think that that's probably the case in most studies that have used samples have been able to demonstrate that that's the case too.
And you think the hard break laws, black people do hard break laws more often than white, but in light break laws, it's similar, like drug or driver taxes, fine, or other. White and black people are similar, but in hard break laws, break laws.
So these are like you're saying like the more severe ones, like the ones that are more harmful.
Yes, I think that in hard break laws, like killing other people,
yeah,
there are more black people, but in light break laws, it's similar.
So I will say this, there is an important thing that you find here, which is that when you look at populations who commit violent crime, right? So these are assaults, right, and murders, those types of things. Yes, numerically, African Americans probably, in most statistics of the word, commit more of those crimes. However, if you take that study and then you control, right, you use statistical tests to control for poverty and the impact of being poor, or the impact of living in a place that's poor, or the impact of having a job, or the impact of not having education, and that actually explains almost entirely the differences between blacks and whites. So if I were to say that blacks commit more violent crime, that's probably true, but that probably doesn't reflect the fact that blacks are more violent. It actually reflects the fact that they are unfairly more likely denied education, that they actually unfairly have less jobs, and that unfortunately, because of our system of slavery and after that discrimination, that they're poor.
Yes, it's all about black community. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Living in black community.
Well, to be clear, just understand what you're saying, it's all about the community characteristics.
Yes.
Yeah. And white communities that have those same characteristics also have high levels of crime.
Yes.
It's just that there's a lot less of those.
It's all about the place where you
Yes, I'd say. Let's go here first.
How will you become attorney And what's the requirements to become attorney in USA?
Okay, so the question is, what are the requirements to become an attorney in the United States? So in the United States, after you have to get a bachelor's degree. So we have our first college degree, bachelor's degree in either arts or sciences, is approximately 4 years. Is a 4-year degree. You study, you get that, and then you go on to a law school, and so you get a special law school. A special degree, the Juris Doctor. I know that's not necessarily the case in all countries. I'm not sure if that's the case here in Russia, but these are actually 2 separate degrees. So you get the first one, a bachelor's degree, then you get a law degree. Once you get that law degree, you are now a JD, I guess, and in some cases people will say that you're already a lawyer by that point. But then you have to get a license to practice. So you can have the degree, but until you pass a state test, the state bar exam, you can't actually give any legal advice or practice law or appear in court at all. So you get the first degree, 3 to 4 years. Law school is typically 3 years. You get a Juris Doctorate. Then you have to study and pass the state bar. And only after that are you able to call yourself a lawyer. So I studied first. I got a degree in environmental science, actually. It was my bachelor's degree. And I went from environmental science to law school. And then after that, I took the bar exam, and that was how I became a lawyer.
What about age? Age or?
So there's no age restrictions, right? So if it's possible for you to go to, well, actually, let me not say that. I'm not even aware of this. There could be an age requirement of 18 or something like that. I'd have to check that. If it were possible for you to go through all that school, right? Usually people take the full 4 years to get that degree. Sometimes they do it in 3, and sometimes they graduate high school early so they get a chance to start that. But most people finish with their first degree about 21, 22. Then you go to law school, 3 years, that's standard. There's really no way of speeding that up. Even if you're a really good student, most schools you have to do 3 years. So that almost ensures that you'll be around 25, 24 by the time you graduate from law school. And then you have to take that test. And for some people that takes a couple times, so that you can add another year or so. But for me, for instance, I graduated from law school, I was 25, and then I took the bar, and I became a lawyer at 25.
It's the first time.
Yeah, actually no. The first time I took the bar, I didn't pass it. So you caught me on the question. You have me being very honest. I have to admit to everybody my failures. It was actually a kind of funny story. I only have, I guess, a few minutes, but I will say, so I mentioned a bunch of different things that I was doing after law school. I decided that I didn't want to practice law, but I wanted to have the license because I had spent all that money going to school. It's very expensive law school in the United States. So I decided not to actually be a lawyer, though, so I spent the first couple of years after graduating law school being a firefighter. And I was studying for the bar while I was being a firefighter, and I guess I got really, really kind of full of myself and thought, this bar exam, I think I can pass it. And so the first time I took the bar, I showed up to take the test in firefighter gear because I had actually been on shift as a firefighter the day before. And the way it works in the United States is when a firefighter shows up for work, they show up for that full day. And they're just there waiting for emergencies to happen. They wake up anytime during the day. They sleep in the fire department, right? And so I had spent the night in the fire department. I think I might have woken up maybe once or twice for a medical call. And I woke up in the morning and thought, I guess I'll take this law exam now. Needless to say, in South Carolina, the law exam is a 3-day exam. I got the results back, and it ended up that on the second and third day, I passed those tests. But go figure, the first day I didn't. I couldn't just wake up after having been a firefighter and take this test. I guess I'm not that smart. So I ended up having to take it again. But I did. I took the very next administration. I got it. I was still 25 when I took it, so that was just last year. No, not. That was how I passed it.
What is the secret about double name?
The double name. So the first name is an African name. And my mom explained it as being from Ghana. I can't remember what exactly she said it meant, but she said it was the name of a king. And you know, people ask me that all the time. I'm really supposed to do some research on it, and I kind of never do. So I'm just going with the King thing because that sounds good. The Lamar is a family middle name on my dad's side, so she put it in there for that. And then the Blount-Hill, Blount is my mom's last name, and Hill is my dad's last name. She actually comes from a very large family. There's 9 of them. She has 8 siblings, but only one of them is a boy. So it's a household of 8 girls, of which my mom was one of them, and I had one uncle from my mom's side of the family, and that uncle went on to have 4 children, but all 4 of them were girls. And so up until very recently, of course, the kind of cultural norm is that the woman sheds her last name and takes on the name of her husband. And if we followed that through, that would have meant that Blount, my mom's last name, would have passed down to 8 girls, but then they would have gotten married, so they would have gotten rid of their names. And then it passed down to my uncle, but then he had 4 girls, and so they would have gotten married and lost their names too. And so the name would have been gone. And so basically all of my mom's sisters figured out ways of inserting Blount into the names of all their male children. So now there'll still be Blount swap. Well, I don't have kids, but my brother and sister will do their job and make sure that a Blount name gets passed on to kids after that. Yes, ma'am.
Who just represents prosecution during the trial?
Who represents prosecution?
Attorney or somebody else?
Yeah, so it'll be the district attorney, the elected person, doesn't, right? Because that would be far too much for them. They hire what are called assistant district attorneys, and they have like a bunch of them. And yeah, they represent the people, right? So they represent the state's prosecution. Yeah, I think. Any other questions there?
And does the term barristers used in America?
No, that's a British term coming from the British system. Yeah, but we don't use that. No. In some cases, we do use solicitor, which is also a thing. I'm not really sure how that's defined, the difference between solicitor and barrister in the UK system. But in some cases, in some states, solicitor is used. And in the federal system, we have what's called a solicitor general. So the attorney general also doesn't go to court. The federal attorney general also doesn't go to court. But we have a highly appointed office called the solicitor general, and they're the ones who represent, for instance, the United States government in the Supreme Court when they're arguing for the government's position. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the lecture. It was very informative. You said that in some states in USA, as I remember you said about Brooklyn, often providing referendums in the state level. And can you give some examples which questions they concern? Because in our country, this democratic institute is not such developed, because in some subjects of Russia, even the old history of this living, they are not providing referendums because there are very strict requirements in the law.
Okay. Well, so some examples of referendums, and so one, you did catch as an important point that it's only some states, so it's up to the state whether it actually incorporates that within its laws. Some states are really good about that. I don't have at the top of my head the list of states that have referendums versus the ones that don't, but California is a very famous example of a state that has a lot of referendums because anybody, I think, as our honorary Californian can tell you, Californians are, kind of like really activist people. So they're kind of laid back, but then they're like very liberal and like, I have an opinion on something and I want it in government. And so they do a lot of referendums. Some pretty famous cases of referendums in California, well, 2 actually big things. The one would be environmental regulations. California is a very strong proponent, a very strong state with regard to the environment. They have very strict environmental regulations there, and several referendums have just been passed recently to make some of those things even more strict. Some of this, because the government there is actually pretty liberal, a lot of it has been passed through the legislature, so it didn't need a referendum. But there's been a few other instances where Californians have been able to pass through direct vote even stronger regulations. Another famous case is actually, in our case, gay marriage, right? Marriage, same-sex marriage. And that was actually pretty important in California because actually in 2008, when Barack Obama got elected, there was actually a massive campaign to stop same-sex marriage in California because I believe it was the courts in California that had actually instituted, had actually ruled that marriage was constitutional between the same sex. And there was a campaign to get the public to vote against it. And so a lot of people showed up to vote for Barack Obama, of course, but there was also a lot of people who showed up to overturn gay marriage. And then it actually happened, I believe there was another referendum to try to repeal that. And of course the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, actually made same-sex marriage legal nationally. Right? But these are two examples of areas where the referendum process has been a pretty important one in California.
Okay, so there are some restrictions by the federal law, some spheres which you can't provide the referendum in the state level.
Yeah, there's actually no referendum process in the federal system, right? So all federal laws have to go through the legislator, and if not, then it can't be voted on.
Speaking about the punishment, I heard that there is a death penalty for juveniles. Is it true?
No, in the United States, no death penalty for juveniles. But we do still have the death penalty in the United States. And that's a pretty interesting thing. Depending on the state, you can see different laws that apply for the death penalty. And most states don't actually have a lot of actual executions. Most states have kind of put a moratorium on it. And I'm speaking a little bit, I'm looking at Daniel, this is more of your expertise. You may even know more about what happens in the United States than I do on this point. But there are certain states within the United States that actually, they do the bulk of executions in America, including, for instance, Texas. And so it's actually an interesting thing to look at how that's been carried out in our system because we have this federalist system. Even if on the federal level there haven't been executions, then the various states are able to execute based on the state criminal justice system. And so when you're looking at the death penalty in the United States to see how it operates, you actually have to look at the federal system and all the different states just to see what the law is exactly. Does that sound like what you heard, Daniel? Is that wrong on some point? Yeah, okay. Do we have a question?
I have a question about the elections. Maybe a little bit off topic, but anyway. As I know, because there are indirect elections, at one of the stage, two groups form. Am I right? Two groups of people, Democrat.
Yeah.
So if one of them won, so we have, for example, a group of Democrats, and should members of that group vote for a Democratic candidate, or they can vote for a Republican candidate?
Oh, so you mean as a voter, for instance, if I'm a Democrat, yeah, can I vote for a Republican when I vote? Is that what you're asking?
Sorry, in group of
college, inside college. Yeah. So you elect a member of college.
Okay. Oh, the electoral college. Okay. Yeah. So in the electoral college, they typically reflect the votes of the majority of their state, right? So we are voting through them. Yes, they do get to vote, but they don't really have much of a say in how they vote. They just kind of vote depending on what the majority was in their state. It's actually, most Americans don't even know what electors are, that they're actually people and stuff, because it just reflects whatever the state does. That said, it is possible for them to do that. In fact, in this last election, There was a scheme to try to get some of the electors to just like vote the other way, to just switch, even though the popular vote in some of their states have reflected that Donald Trump won. There was the thought that, hey, we might need to just vote against him anyway. They didn't, right? They followed what the majority vote was. But it is possible, I suppose, for that to happen. It never does, so I have to admit, I don't have enough examples in mind to let you know what would happen if it ever were to. Yes, sir.
There is a contradiction between institute of death penalty and natural laws, isn't it?
Well, so I'm out of my depth on that question. I'm gonna admit, right? So I haven't done a lot of kind of study of the debates in this area, but certainly there are huge both philosophical, like moral, ethical, and just kind of practical questions about the rightfulness of the death penalty. But there are certainly these opinions on both sides. I don't know if it's possible to say for certain what the answer on that should be. For that, I would just kick it back to some of my colleagues over who study that a little bit more. Or we might be able to talk about that, about my personal opinions about it. That said, my personal opinions, because I don't study the death penalty, are just kind of my personal opinions, and I don't know enough about the philosophical debates there to tell you exactly where most people come down on that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the lecture. Could you tell me, please, does the American prosecutor's offices have the supervision functions? Because in Russia we have.
Supervision functions over what? Like, tell me what you mean by that.
For example, of other law enforcement bodies.
So no, technically, right? So for instance, does the Brooklyn's prosecutor's office oversee the local police department, right, the NYPD? No. But since there's rule of law, then if members of the NYPD break the law, then their cases can be prosecuted by the prosecutor's office. And so in that way, we're able to do oversight of the police department, the prosecutor's offices. However, within state government, so under the mayor and the non-prosecutorial state government, there are agencies. For instance, in New York, there's the city's Department of Investigations. That entire department is based on trying to find instances of public misconduct, fraud, and like, including by police officers. And so that agency might find an example and launch an investigation into the NYPD. They could find some sort of violation. They could bring that into court, and they could turn over that investigation to the prosecutor's office. When that happened, then the prosecutor could decide whether they were going to prosecute the police officer or the police department or not. There also are pretty famously now in the United States cases, right, where individual police officers are possibly prosecuted by the prosecutor's office. Actually, given our topic, this has become a major issue in the cases where police officers shoot and kill unarmed black people, right? That's been like a pretty big thing. And that's all been a case where prosecutors' offices decide whether they think the case against the officer is strong enough, that is, that the officer was so wrong that they can prove that that officer should be prosecuted. And in many cases, actually, the prosecutor's offices have brought charges against those police officers. In most of the cases, the prosecutors lose those cases, and juries decide that the police officer was okay. But the prosecutor's offices have been prosecuting more and more officers for those offenses. What was that the question there?
Thank you. Could you say your personal opinion about legalization of different kinds of drugs? I mean, light ones and heavy ones,
It's illegal to speak about in this service.
So I have to tell you, in order to get my unvarnished opinion, you'll have to catch me outside of the talk. Because it's almost impossible for me to say something that can't be potentially seen as almost representing the people that I work for. And I obviously, my personal opinion isn't what governs that. So my personal opinion, though, is that Yeah, to the extent that drugs are a problem, I think most of where we're going policy-wise in the United States is that it is a public health problem. And so if we think that drugs are wrong, that you shouldn't use them, that they destroy lives, blah, 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 I don't actually have to debate with you whether that's the case or not. If I think that that's the case, that still doesn't mean I have to prosecute it or that I have to send you to jail for it, right? It could be that I think it's the case that you should not use drugs so they can make you addicted, but if drugs have all this harm in your life, then I can actually provide services to treat you, to get you not to use them. I can educate you on why you shouldn't use them, and then if you do, provide some sort of program to get you off of them. And so there's been all these approaches that have been designed to stop drug use that aren't criminal justice based.
The last question.
The last question.
Yeah, is there one last question?
Do you like Russian?
So first of all, I can make any question long by just talking, but I'm not. It's been great. I've been here only a couple of days, so I still have a lot more of even Yekaterinburg to see, and Russia is a huge country, so I guess I haven't seen anything but Yekaterinburg yet, but I've enjoyed my time here, and thank you guys.
He has a long-term visa, so 3 years you can...
You have not suffered in vain, you know?
Yeah, well, I definitely would like to come back so far, so, maybe you'll be seeing me again.